Hello, everyone. I'll go up here because there's a mic and we are recording it all, so that seems nice. Thank you so much for coming. This is really exciting. Jonatan, thank you for attracting such a crowd. That's really nice. So we're here today for Jonatan Habib Engqvist's lecture, which will bring a historic perspective on Nordic moving image and new media art. And first of all, I just want to say thank you to NYU Tisch School of the Arts and also to the Swedish Consulate for supporting this event. So this lecture is part of Nordic Outbreak, which is an exhibition project presented by Streaming Museum. And for those of you who just hear about this today, who just jump in for this lecture, Nordic Outbreak is an exhibition project for public space. We are presenting more than 30 Nordic artists working with moving image from the Nordic art scene in 5 different public spaces here in New York and also at Scandinavia House. Nordic Outbreak contains both these exhibitions and also a series of public events. And we opened last Sunday, where we celebrated the last night of showing Björk's Video Mutual Core, directed by Andrew Thomas Hwang, across 15 screens in Times Square. So we had a nice little opening party, and this week is just full of exhibitions and events, and you only missed out on a little. There's still a lot more going on. This lecture here today is really leading up to a symposium which we're having on Saturday at Scandinavia House, where we will have 12 Nordic artists, curators, and theorists presenting their perspectives on new and current dynamics in Nordic moving image, and also we will discuss the impact of exhibition making in public space. And really, what does it mean when you bring moving image to public space in various forms of installations? Streaming Museum, which was founded by Nina Kolosi in 2008 and which presents Nordic Outbreak, has been showing art on screens. We have a network of more than 50 screens on all continents. So bringing moving image to public space is really at the center of this. But today we're gonna take a closer look on the history of this Nordic moving image and address this contested idea of Nordicness, which you can hardly say without causing great drama, because is there even such a thing as Nordicness? And you touch upon identity and a lot of interesting things. So I would just like to introduce Jonatan Habib Engqvist, who is a theorist and curator based in Stockholm. He has previously worked at Södertörn University, the Royal Institute, as a curator at the Moderna Museet in Stockholm, and as a project manager at the Swedish Arts Grants Committee, International Exchange Program for Visual Art, also known as JASPIS. And last year, Jonatan curated the Reykjavik Arts Festival, and I should also mention that in about a month from now, he has a book coming out called Independence. Yes. Yeah, very nice. I forgot to say my name. My name is Tanya Toft. And together with Nina Kolosi sitting down there, I have, and together with a lot of other people, curated and produced Nordic Outbreak. So, yes, I think we're ready for Jonatan. And thank you very much for coming.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for coming here on this fantastic day. I don't know if I would have come. The weather is absolutely marvelous. So I am very grateful to have someone to talk to. Now, the privilege of generalizing, I'm going to do this kind of European style. I've written a lot of it down. The privilege of generalizing about the Nordic region, and actually coming from the Nordic region, should not be underestimated. Likewise, the difficulty of such a task, speaking about the region from inside, so to speak, should not be underestimated either. Especially within the framework of, was it 4 hours? Yeah? 4.5? Yeah. Okay. So that's probably what I've got on here. So scream if it gets too much. I'm going to have to cut into this because I realized yesterday that it's way too much, and there's even so there are so many artists and things that I would want to talk about and to mention that didn't fit here. So that's the way it goes, and that's also part of the difficulty of the task. Okay, so to this story of moving images, naturally the widespread international exchange over the last decades means that the question of Nordic identity, as you said, Tanya, is complicated. But I think what I will try to do is kind of to present a few bits and pieces that might have been overlooked in a kind of general canon of writing history in general, and looking at a few examples from these countries. The thing is that I'm having problems with my PowerPoint. Never mind. Okay, so I'm probably going to. I added this little things here, and I'm probably going to be talking more about things than images. So by presenting some stories and anecdotes from the region stemming from early modernity to today, the idea is to show various connections between, or breakouts from these stories. And then I hope to connect them to the current scene in the region. And the idea is to try to talk about it in relation to New York. So on the one hand, I attempt to contemplate a history of moving images related to visual art in the Nordic context, mostly things. And on the other hand, if I make it, I will propose a take on what could be called the Nordic thing, through a speculative account of how this projection might relate to moving images in and from the Nordic countries on the level of some kind of common narrative framework for interpretation. Okay? It gets worse. Now, things can, of course, refer to moving objects rather than mere representation of objects. This, I hope, is a relevant standpoint when looking at certain parts of the history of this specific area. With the Nordic connection to EAT, or Experiments in Art and Technology. You know, was there someone not? Okay. Early influential scene for kinetic sculpture, digital programming in Finland. The fact that psychedelic wet slides where acid is placed between thin sheets of glass and you project through them, was developed by a Danish artist in the 60s, or how the dominance of fluxus and thus the relationships to things, particularly to the development of the art scenes in Denmark and Iceland, from Theorist moving there in 1957 and the Danish influence from the art schools there has affected these expressions, the expressions that are proper to these areas. That was a long sentence. So in regard to this, one could also to a certain extent, perhaps, use the label moving things to point out the close connections between video and performance art, maybe, on a more general level, which is sometimes forgotten in historical surveys, especially art historical surveys, I would say. Now, one could speak of moving things rather than moving images to simply point out the concrete aspects of experimental film and moving images in general. So, for instance, I might begin with a man with the most appropriate name for this context, Viking Eggeling, born 1810 and died 1925. So you understand it's old stuff. He is a filmmaker who received due attention long after his death in 25, and it was partly because he spent a great deal of his life outside his native country, hanging out with the Dada movement, Russian constructivists, and so on and so forth. And partly because he was quite far ahead of his time. I'm going to show you a little clip. I'll just leave the light, I think. Right. Was this it? Or was it the other one called? Okay, sorry. We'll let it run for another minute. So this is, to my knowledge, one of the earliest animations, actually, that you're seeing here. Okay. It's not doing what. Oh, here we go. I was too fast. So, in a letter to his sister, Viking once wrote that he wanted to create a new communication machine based on his own theories of visual communication. Diagonal Symphony from 24 is made with the classic single shot technique of animated film. It's made on a light box. The objects are lightened from underneath with a fixed camera. Originally he made them out of paper, but it was too light, so he made them out of tinfoil. And it's an entirely manual, very laborious process, as you understand. Bearing in mind that both camera and projector at this time were entirely manual, it's quite a complicated thing to do. Nonetheless, I said his work has been highly influential, and not least during the say 50s and 60s, and the circles around Pont-au-Sultan, who I'll get back to soon. And it can be found in the collection of Moderna Museet, among other places. Oops. So before I move on, I guess the correct way to do this would be to start by stressing that the notion of Nordic history is problematic in itself, because there's no such thing as an essentially Nordic art history, given that the concept of Nordic, let alone the idea of singular history, is awkward, politically engineered, etc., etc., etc. And go on to spend a large portion of this talk arguing for something that most people in this room probably already agreed with in the first place. So, bear with me while I do this a different way and take it to a structural level, and just start by sketching out the discursive terrain of Nordic-ness as it is manifest today before I kind of dig into the history. Because to be frank, and this will have to stay between us in this room, in 2013 the majority of the artists and professionals from this specific geographical region, and discursive region maybe, that more or less exists, read Nordic and think funding. That's how it works. And I'm not moralizing. It's just a simple fact, and there's nothing really wrong with it at all. It's a factor that is important, however, to understand and get a grip on the mechanics of the region. And indeed, the main financial sources that make international and bilateral exchange through exhibitions, research, talks like this one possible in the year 2013, including National Arts Council and Nordic culture points, embassies, provide good examples of the notions of the Nordic that are more or less tied to funding. And it wouldn't be possible without these structures. We don't really have this commercial scene to speak about at all. I'm sorry if I'm jumping. I'm having problems with this. Here we go. We are by now fully aware that you can get brownie points for Iceland, for Greenland, and nowadays also for the Baltic states, from several Nordic funding bodies. And we see this in exhibitions. We also know that you can get money by being critical to the system, by saying that you want to question the fact that you can get these brownie points. Because questioning ourselves is kind of what we do. To question ourselves, our motives, and why we do what we do is indeed a very Nordic thing. You know, we live in these little red houses in the middle of the countryside. It's dark 6 months a year, and we question this. Especially on a day like this. So, for example, Denmark's pavilion in Venice 2011, curated by Katarina Gregos, was titled The Freedom of Speech. as Denmark's most crucial sales argument at this time is that in Denmark, we can criticize Denmark. Make no mistake, I'm not here to preach, and both Katarina Gregos and the artist she selected for the pavilion, this is Stelios Faitikis, including pardon? Yeah, thank you. Including Superflex, who participated by not participating, managed to produce a remarkable, deeply critical, and by no means illustrative or politically engineered project. That's not what I'm saying. I simply want to stress the point that the definition of Nordic, as related to funding, including a questioning of the equation between Nordic identity and funding, which, not at the least, is applicable in times of economic pressure, is part of what constitutes the scene, and thus the Nordic pathology as such. But isn't it more interesting to talk about something else? This is the first image, first page of an image Google on Nordic art. I'll get back to image number 2 in a minute. Actually, the only one that's really of relevance here today. The point is, if we want to break out from the pathology, so to speak, this notion of Nordic, one could at least ask if there, perhaps due to opportunities opened up by, for instance, peer-to-peer funding, exists a kind of informal communality, a Nordic model that could be applied to the art world in the region. And I mean, this happens if you're in a show with artists from other places. You start talking, and things happen, and this generates a scene. I mean, so there's a very intricate connection between the structural level of things and the outcome. It will hopefully become clear that the factor that initiatives coming from the artists themselves can receive economic support from national and Nordic funding bodies, and have been able to do so for a long time, has created an environment strongly defined by artists also on an institutional level, since it is a system that to a great extent empowers the practitioners themselves. So last year, as Tanya mentioned, I commissioned some work in conjunction to this Nordic Biennale, which I organized, which tried to address some of these questions. Brownie points for that. In short, several trajectories of artist-initiated and artist-run practices from the region, spanning the last 40 years, served as a kind of genealogical background to the following questions. Do we share common alternative histories in the Nordic region? If so, what are they, and is it relevant to pursue them today? How have these networks changed over time? Is it possible, or even desirable, to create dynamic and sustainable collaborations? Even if I won't go into the details of the exhibitions or the results of the investigation today, I can anecdotally conclude that the average lifespan of any artist-initiated project in the Nordic region, or the majority of the artist-initiated projects in the region, the last 4 decades seems to be 2 years, regardless to governing funding structures. And I think that's also an important factor when you look at the history of things. The artists get together, they manage for about 2 years, and then they either start a new environment or a new context, or it dies for some other reason. Another point to be made before kind of entering the historical minefield of Nordic histories in regard to these structures is that Nordic collaboration does not have to be symptomatic of a European crisis. I just should stress that, as it might have been when the political alliance was articulated in its contemporary form in the 1930s. Even if this, of course, would be a very tempting analogy to use as an argument for the sudden prevalence of the question today on all over the place, basically. So perhaps by stating that Nordic collaboration boomed in the 30s could suggest a final reason why this is a minefield. The rise of nationalism, which concurs with the interest for the Nordic, is something that seems to worry many worried Scandinavians. Just last week, 2 major venues in the city of MoMA went out publicly to declare they will take no part in the MoMA city's major investment for the summer of 2013. You guessed it, Malmö Nordic. One motivation being that you can't define art by artists in the region as specifically Nordic, which in my head sounds a bit like universalism. And that the very idea of Nordic art is in fact racist, excluding and a complicated promotional campaign. I'm not going to dig into this. I'm just kind of laying out the cards. Given this background, the way I choose to see it today is that if we, in the Nordic art world, do not reclaim these more or less structural definitions of the Nordic, according to our own understandings and misunderstandings of this space, other political forces will simply execute the process of redefinition on our behalf. And I leave it at that. If I make it to part 2, that's what it's about. So back to the second image of that search, and backtracking and simplifying matters in general just for the sake of space and clarity, one can say that a decade ago, journals like Sixi and Mu, Contemporary Art Review, contributed to defining conversation in what became known as the Nordic Miracle of Nordic contemporary art of late 90s, early thousands. When, among other things, these publications disappeared, it created a vacuum in discourse. Now, as we see today, technology has facilitated web-based critique within the region, and there seems to be a renewed interest on the part of both local and global art world to catch up, so to speak. I'm thinking of journals like Kunstkritik or formats that have totally that have popped up these last few years in the region. This tendency goes beyond nostalgia and perhaps also transcends a mere inter-institutional interest. And it's not least due to regional possibilities that are opened up through these unique systems of peer-to-peer funding, which sort of allows the artists themselves to keep these networks alive. Do you agree, Birta? Oh, good. So, in short, there are hopefully 2 engaging ways to deal with the Nordic history of moving things, which seem both fun and relevant to pursue. The first would be these anecdotes and myths from the region, show some footage, and talk about why these are relevant in relationship to understanding a certain development on a global scale. This is from Homage to New York, which I'll get back to. The other strategy is simply to affirm the notion of le nordique entirely and illustrate this thesis with a selection of the abundance of artwork at hand that could serve as subjective evidence for the claim. See if we get around to it. I will, in the following, anyway, attempt to do both. I might do this by talking about the weather, because it's something we talk a lot about. In order to make sense of this slightly schizophrenic dual vision, which is another Nordic predicament, which I won't go into just yet, the talk will be divided into 2 parts. The first will be about moving things, and the other about the Nordic thing. In both cases, I just want to say that it's about the Nordic region as a mental, cultural, discursive sphere rather than a purely geographical area. The point of showing these 2 images together, maybe that wasn't perfectly clear, is this is Tingeli and this is Peter Geschwind from 2009. I didn't manage to get the video from his last show. It didn't run on my computer, but it was very interesting to see the direct connections between what he did on his last show and that stuff. So first of all, I should credit this slightly nerdy part of the talk because it's loosely based on some research I did together with the curator and art historian called Björn Norberg a few years ago, when we both worked at Mayan Labs, which was a small space in central Stockholm dedicated to new media, which no longer exists. Yeah, and the idea is to not drop too many names, but kind of connect it to them, to New York. So, in order to contextualize the Nordic scene in terms of media art, one should perhaps begin in the 60s. This was a utopian time in Scandinavian history. The welfare state was in good shape, the spirit of entrepreneurship and curiosity over the possibilities of technology in experimental art prevailed, international influences were starting to seriously take root, and there was some money to go around. Curators, or producers as they were called at the time, together with artists, started to investigate the possibilities of technology alongside with civil engineers. Jointly, the groups attempted to break down and reconfigure any established forms around art by questioning older techniques, dissolving, reconstructing images, and in short, treating moving images as things, and vice versa. There are a number of different groups, institutions, and key figures in this development. Many of them are still active, gaining new audience and followers over generations. But there are also organizations and collaborations, of course, which no longer exist, that have, through their activities in the 60s anyway, become a major source of inspiration. And recently, I would say, also for critique. For instance, in the dissolving of work and leisure, which we see taking place now, the ambiguities of certain political art movements that took, you see the result, you see their children today, and the more negative effects of seeing children as subjects in general. I'm thinking most closely about the artist Joanna Lombard, who's in an exhibition also now, actually, which is up at Tensta Konsthallen in Stockholm, curated by Lars Bang Larsson, which is called, in English, The Society Without Characteristics, or something like that. Samhället utan egenskaper. Which is very much kind of reflecting on the effects of the social engineered. This is from Palle Nelson's Modellen, which is a very much talked about and influential work, which would be totally impossible, I think, to produce at Moderna Museet today, given security regulations and everything. But you get it. It's kind of Cedric Price-inspired architecture with these soft cushions, and you can jump around in it. And it's quite fun. Just like last 2012, I saw an exhibition with Icelandic artist Kurver, who was totally related to this, and did a family exhibition where he covered the Living Art Museum with grass and had a bouncy tower and so on. Okay, so one could claim, and people have done so, that one of the most influential key figures of the Nordic global scene was an engineer, at least when it comes to this kind of kinetic art, which also fits well with the cliché image of Nordic organizational capacity and the Nordic model. I'm thinking of Billy Kluver and the group of experiments in art and technology. There's been a renewed interest again for this work in the Nordic countries the last decade, partly due to intense discussions on how to deal with notions of artistic research and how to get beyond the quasi-academic pitfalls, perhaps by connecting to an engineering perspective. And from what I understand, it is an interest that has also surfaced here in New York this spring, with presentations both at Independent and MoMA, about a month ago or something. Kluver was born in 1924. He died in 2004. He was born and raised in Sweden, but moved to Paris in the 1950s, where he met Tinguely, which would prove to be an important meeting. Approximately 10 years later, they would meet again in New York and embark on a journey into experimental art. He was employed as an engineer at Bell Industries Bell Lab in New York, and the director of Moderna Museet at the time, Pontus Hultén, asked Kluver to contact Tinguely and see if he needed some help technically, since he was going to make a large installation in the backyard of MoMA. The result was the famous Homage to New York, which was built of bits of chairs and bicycles and stuff that they found on the streets and in the city dumps. And then during the performance night, the whole thing went up in smoke. Even so, Robert Rosenberg then asked Kluver for help with an installation called The Oracle, now in the collections of Centre Pompidou in Paris. Kluver was not able to help with all the technology he required, but together they built up an interactive installation that ran via radio frequency. So the rumor spread, and all these artists started calling Billy Kluver with different projects, different proposals, and he started to engage his colleagues at Bell Labs at night, and as the amount of proposals increased, they, together with some other artists, decided to start this experiments in art and technology. I have a short clip from the Pepsi Cola Pavilion. Do you want to see it? I have to. It's a silent version because the other one's with a Swedish speaker, so it's but it could be fun to run. So I'm just going to show a few minutes of it because I'm already spending too much time. So eventually the experiments performed within EAT became an official activity of Bell Labs and was magnified in the Project 9 evenings, where different artists invited, collaborated. There we go. No? Oh, sorry about that. It's just, this is actually the interior of it. I could show some, it's the outside, it had smoke machines and, from what I understand, actually the snow machine was invented in conjunction to this, and the one that you use when you go skiing. This is very blurry. Yeah, you get the idea. I'm not going to talk so much about it because I'm a bit stressed for time. But it's just nice to see some original footage from inside the pavilion. So among the artists that were associated with this cluster of engineers and artists was, of course, Robert Rosenberg, but also the Swede Öyvind Fahlström, 28 to 76, who made a performance, or rather a theatrical play, which included very many diverse medias. Fahlström was a pioneer within Swedish sound art and poetry, but he also understood the power of mass media at an early stage, especially television. And obviously he used both paper and TV shows to market, newspapers and TV shows to market his actions, gaining a new and a larger audience. And in his piece for 9 evenings, he had some very complicated technological solutions. For instance, he asked for snow that would fall upwards. This is a still from a film called De Gamla de Fria, which is also an emblematic film by Fahlström. And what they're doing here is they're in a large public square and they're playing a game. And it's socially critical game. Yeah. And it kind of gives you a sign of the times. This is also just another Fahlström. So Fahlström went on to become one of the most important artists within psychedelic art and pop art movie, I would say, but has perhaps been of less importance for moving image scene, even if I think like De Gamla de Fria was very influential in terms of this kind of quasi-documentary genre of filmmaking and insulting the royalty and things like that. But he did work a lot with radio, and even today a lot of artists refer to this work. So Billy Cleaver has definitely been a major influence. He also became a very important contact for Moderna Museet in Stockholm and its director, Pontus Hultén. Under his direction, the museum became one of the most dynamic European art institutions of the 60s, I might claim. And the first important contribution was the legendary exhibition Moving Art, or Rörelsekonsten, which also went on tour in Europe from '61. With the help from Cleaver, Hultén and the museum invited a number of artists dealing with different forms of kinetic art, including the work of Tingeli. The exhibition and its experimental form had an enormous impact on the scene. I saw this poster today at MoMA. It's up there. It's some of the holes are printed and some of them are punched. So it's by Diderot. And I also thought it could be fun to play a record which is connected to the show. It's roto relief. Museum people are going to get nervous now. It was produced in '61 in conjunction to the Moving Art exhibition, and there are a few statements related to kinetic art on it. It's Tommaso Marinetti reading poetry, reading the Futurist Manifesto, Naum Gaubo reading from the Realist Manifesto, and finally recording from the 1960 homage to New York in the garden of MoMA. Which is basically this machine blowing itself up with an accompanying piano. And there was something I needed to do here. Let's see if I can work it out. No. I forgot. Do I do that? No? Is there anyone here who could help me? I want to switch to this sound. I don't remember what it was I was going to do. Do you remember? No, but it's... I just can't remember which one I put it on. It was... I had to choose projector, all right?
Did you see the picture?
Do you remember? Otherwise, we'll just... Oh, that's the one. That's the one I need. And is it this one? Yeah. Let's see if this works. So I'll just... It's just for this fun.
Back and forth from.
Okay, just stand up. I can't show it.
At this point, I will now play the sound, or actually the last sounds of Mr. Tingwali's Homage to New York, As It Died. I wondered what comments Mr. Tingwali had as he saw his Homage to New York come to life and die. And I asked him, how do you feel now?
Oh, it's fantastic. It's absolutely fantastic. It's very complex and it's the work that has many capacities.
So you get it. This is what you're seeing for those of you who missed it. That's the record, right? More or less. It was made in series. Anyway. Okay. How am I doing for time? I'm running over like crazy. So Tingley would come... Yeah? Oh, sorry. Tingley would come back for another exhibition in '66 with Nick Santafall and Swedish artist P.O. Ulfstedt, whose practice could be described as somewhere between Duchamp's rose reliefs and Tingley. Together with Hultin, they started to plan what to do quite close to the exhibition, a few weeks before the exhibition. And this is what they came up with. Late in the process, they decided to build a gigantic woman in the style of Santafall in papier-mâché. Inside the 28 by 8 meter sculpture, they placed a multimedial exhibition, including a milk bar in the right breast, a planetarium and screening of the Milky Way in the left, a mechanical man watching TV in her heart, and in one of her arms a screening of Greta Garbo movie. And in one of her legs there was a gallery with fake paintings of old masters, executed mostly by Pontus Hultin himself. The audience entered the sculpture through her sex. So here you have them. The installation, called She, became a great success. Hultin would in 1968 go on to curate the machine as seen at the end of the Mechanical Age at MMA, Modernisette, including pieces of Namjoon Paik before he, in '73, became director of Centre Pompidou in Paris. It's quite fascinating how international this situation was, with these people just exchanging and talking and sending letters. And okay, so looking at the 70s and 80s, there seemed to be a turn towards installations in film. I think I should mention Gunvor Nelson. I mean, she's worth it. I'm just going to give you a short clip. From My Name is Una, just to give you a feeling.
My name is Una. 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 Una, 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 una.
So, oddly enough, there seemed to be... This is also Gunvor Nelson. I just thought it was fun. It's it's the cover of U2 War. I don't know if anyone's reflected on the fact that it's actually Gunvor Nelson, who was a fantastic photographer also. So, oddly enough, there seemed to be a general skepticism towards computer-based art at this time, and it would take until 80s, maybe, until even video was widely accepted in the region. Sort of Gary Hill was introduced in the late 80s and 90s. To a certain extent, Moderne Museet didn't play the same important role, I would say, as it did in the field in the 60s. Instead, there was a sort of turn towards socially engaged practices, artists doing their own thing, documentary, experimental filmmaking, and other venues became more dominant, kind of in the formulation of what was going on, like Fylking or other places, which I'll talk about in a minute. One can also say that a sort of situationist rejection of individual production in art blended rather nicely with a notion of individual and community, which already prevailed in the Nordic scene and mentality. In society, perhaps, supported by social democratic policies. Pop-Out's ideas regarding the representation of objects as absent from meaning, together with the early video experiments, became defining during the 80s, I would say, as well. The development that took place was more along single artists and a few smaller groups who more or less belonged to the margin. And it would take until the mid-90s and the internet boom for a larger movement of Nordic, sort of more new media-based arts, when artists started to organize themselves. I think primarily when artists started to organize themselves and share equipment, because it was really expensive to buy things. And when they found means of creating these common studio spaces and this common means of production, then it just started to happen. So important examples of these kind of clusters or contexts is Crack in Stockholm, computer room for art, collective room for art computing or something like that. Atelier Nord in Oslo, which started in '65 as a studio and workshop for graphic artists, and then included visual and digital studios in '93 maybe. Bergen Center for Electronic Arts in Norway's IOLab in Stavanger in Norway, who organized the first article festival for unstable art in November 2006 maybe. and MU in Helsinki in Finland. These are all organizations that have helped artists with knowledge and equipment, as well as running various projects and curating exhibitions and so on. A lot of public space stuff, sort of testing what, moving the gallery space into the public realm and doing things on buses, things like that, on screens. In the 90s, there were also a number of organizations devoted to the production of arts, projects and exhibitions, apart from those already mentioned, that might be interesting to note here in the context of Nordic Outbreak exhibition. Among those, Electrohype in Malmö, which produces the Electrohype Biennale. To my knowledge, they still do it, but it's not always every 2 years. So. And this is from 2008 on the theme Chaos and Structure, Voldemar Johansson's work on the slide. Splinter Mind produced exhibitions for museums and web TV, Good TV, Motherboard from Norway, Pixelake in Finland, definitely, and an annual festival for media art focused on activism, open source, demo scenes, and VJs run by Finnish media artist Juha Huskonen, Katastrofi.fi, which is an artist-run organization formed in 98, maybe. And M-Cult, established around 2000, mainly focusing on participatory wireless urban-based projects. So just a few name drops there anyway. Okay, now I'm going to try to say something about the countries. So to describe the history of Swedish media, there are a number of important independent organizations that have to be mentioned. Apart from Moderna Museet, there are a couple of other central nodes in Sweden. One is Fylkingen, which was founded in 1933 as an association for classical music, and in the 50s it developed towards more experimental music. Produced the first electroacoustic concerts in Sweden in 1952, maybe among the first in Scandinavia. In the 60s the scene became more radical and started up a studio around electroacoustic music called EMS, which is still around. And it's interesting. There's a lot of stuff going on there. It's like there's a new generation taking over the space now. Worth mentioning, just obscure fact, is Göran Sundqvist, who was born 1936. Just keeping to this engineer track, he was an engineer at Saab in Sweden, and from 58 working with the development of pioneering computers such as Saab D2, D21, and D22, the first transistor-based computers in the country. He came in contact with composers at Fylkingen in Stockholm and composed musical pieces with them. He also programmed a few games on it and made digital images, but they had to be photographed in order to be preserved, as he used an oscilloscope as a monitor, and didn't have any options of printing. I just thought it was remind us of what's in here. Both Fylkingen and EMS are, as I said, still important scenes. So I would say, like, the new shift that takes place there right now is, on the one hand, there's still a very strong kind of experimental music, a lot of improvisational music going on there, but also interdisciplinary events, performance-based exhibitions. You could say time-based art production. So the first exhibition at Fylkingen was Ture Sjölander. Ni är fotograferad. You are photographed. Whoops. In 1964, Sjölander, who is born in 1937, belongs to pioneers. He's definitely an art world breakout, for better or worse. Already in his first exhibition, he understood the impact that television had on its audience. After a television show from the exhibition, Sjölander's photography encompassed the raw, I'm not going to show any images, a very raw attitude against photography and the naked model. And there were some 10,000 people who visited the gallery, and this is in a very small city. Stockholm wasn't, 750,000 at that time. So it's quite a big crowd. With this experience in mind, he contacted the National Swedish Television Broadcasting Service in 1965 for another show, where he included exhibitions in 2 cities, billboard advertisements in a 3rd, and a TV production. It was meant to be a large multimedia happening, but the state television refused to broadcast his production since they found it too provocative. Instead, he was offered to make another TV production where he collaborated with the artist Bror Wikström. Sjölander had, according to himself, already as a teenager experimented with distortion on television screens, and along with the engineers at the Swedish television, the artist could perform wild experiments in a piece that was given the title Time. They were not able to work directly with the video signal, so they had to transfer the monitor and film and then back on video to create the effects. So it was quite a complicated process. In '66, Sjölander started to collaborate with the journalist Lars Weck in a project called Monument, where they worked together with Swedish television and television in Germany and television in France. The result was broadcast in the United States, along with several other countries in Asia and Europe, and it was seen by an estimated audience of 150 million viewers. So I thought we could see it. And it's actually described in Expanded Cinema by Gene Youngblood, if you want to read a better explanation of it. So Sjölander and Weck used images of famous paintings and celebrities such as the King of Sweden, the Beatles, Charlie Chaplin, Picasso, Mona Lisa, and distorted them so they were hardly recognizable. Okay, and then it's a bunch. The guy's still around. He lives in Australia, and he's still active as a painter and above all, he blogs a lot. Let me see if I can. Oops. Where can I get full screen here? Sorry. There you go. So just so you get a feeling of what this could look like. It's a coin. It's a 1 krona coin with a portrait of the old king. Yeah, you get it. Okay. It's probably available in 100 versions online. He's rabid. I mean, he's like, everything's up there. So Teresa Wennberg just have a different attitude to computer compared to other artists from the same time. As she had at a very early stage stressed, the computer had an artistic expression in its own right. Discussing computer graphics as things or as objects, she left Sweden for Paris in 1974, where she found a different attitude toward technology than at home. Around 78, she started to work with video and came in contact with Ture Sjölander, and they started to work with Video Nu, or Video Now, an association which became important for the development of video art in Sweden. In '83, she started to work with digital images, and since '98, she's been working as an artist in resident at the Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm. And I think she's still there, with a VR cube environment there, which feels like something really. It wasn't that long ago. VR was the way to go. In 1996, Swedish artists Karin Hansson and Åsa Andersson Broms started the organization Temporary Art, AT, with their first net art exhibition with 20 Danish and Swedish artists. 3 years later, they organized the exhibition Best Before at Tensta Konsthalle, that had a great impact on the Swedish scene. Among the artists in the exhibition, one could find Ola Persson, who, born 64, he died 2006 in a car accident. Ola Persson participated with his piece Yucca Invest Trading Plant, where a yucca palm was connected to a computer via electrodes. The impulses on the palm tree the impulse that the palm tree gave to the internet connected to the computer resulted in a trade on the Swedish stock market. In this piece, he linked the market to nature in an intelligent way, not only through the installations, but also in market terms such as growth, offshots, and so on and so forth. A year later, he created the Nasdaq Vocal Index, which was a choir piece for 8 to 24 different singers, where each singer represented one company stock on the Nasdaq, giving notes in real time according to the currents downloaded from the stock market. And I thought I would just play a piece from that. You get it. It's a fantastic piece. And it's also interesting because it's in real time. If you see it performed several times, I mean, every time it will be completely different, of course, because it's performed in real time. So this is another piece by Ola Persson. It's a pretty bad image, but you know, if you remember what desktops looked like previously, that's it. So basically, you would see a desktop on, but it was actually not a desktop. It was just a monitor, which was filming the wall opposite the monitor, which was painted blue. And then he made little styrofoam icons that were hanging in nylon string. Persson also collaborated with the Interactive Institute in Stockholm, a large research institute with several departments for technology development. The Smart Studio, which later changed its names to simply Art and Technology in 2006. And I don't know, they're having some problems now, so I don't know what's going on there. It's probably most famous for the Brain Ball installation. It was created by a team of artists and engineers, and among them Ariane Kaifes and Thomas Bromé. And basically the game is played by two persons sitting on each side of a table, wearing sensors measuring their brain activity. And the point is to have as little brain activity as possible. So if you reach a lower brain activity than your opponent, the ball starts to roll forward, and the game ends when. So, relax to win. And yeah, this is funny because it's the king. The story doesn't say if he won or not. Let's not go there. Yeah. So Ariane Kaifes was also artist in resident at the Interactive Institute several times, and during the time she worked with a project called Ocular Witness, where she made research on aspects of light seen from the physicist point of view. It was a really remarkable exhibition with very unlike anything else. The project received an honorary mention at Ars Electronica in 2006, along with another Swedish project, Subject, by Italian-born Alberto Frigo, who is currently living in Sweden. So for 10 years so far, Alberto Frigo has photographed every object he has used with his right hand, and plans to continue doing this for until 36 years have passed. And he reorganizes the images according to categories. So this is obviously brushing my teeth. So every time he picks up new objects, he takes out his camera. And it's quite an annoying guy to drink coffee with because he's always... The result can be seen as an investigation in his relation to objects and an enormous database of I don't know how many images so far. This is from 2009. There's another wall. This is like, these are the prints you saw before. But that size, yeah. The project is constantly expanding, and in 2009 he presented 6 different life archives in the exhibition 6/36 years, including snapshots, a dream archive with over 6,000 dreams, musical notations of songs he had heard and could remember, so he wrote down the notes, a film archive comprised of small film sequences from public spaces that he's visited in his daily life and travel, daydreams, and a sound archive, recounting thoughts while walking alone, each recording comprised to 12 seconds. Whoops, dropped the slide. Okay, another method for documenting life can be found in Micke Lundberg, born in 52. He did this project called Lifetime, where he tracks his movements during the GPS device in 2004. And actually, it's okay not to have the image, because the work that I wanted to show is the work that he did in 1994, where he had his remaining lifetime calculated. So he predicted how long he would live based on a physical examination, and then he created a digital clock that counted down the estimated time left on his life in seconds. So you can just watch it go. So maybe it's better not to have an image of it. And then, even if she isn't of Swedish origin, I'd like to mention Lisa Jävebrott. I mean, she is, even though she is of Swedish origin, but maybe more of an LA artist, it's good to mention her, because she's probably mostly known outside Sweden. She moved to the States in '94 and started to work with email art in her project Hey Good, which means Hi God. A year later, she started to work with web art, so pretty early on. She didn't belong to a group, and she still lives in California from what I know, and is, I think, employed as associate professor there at the university. She was at least member of the group C5, if they're still around. Do you know, Jakob, if C5 are still around? No. She often produces web-based work with a typical kind of meta-web touch. This is kind of specific aesthetics, maybe, of new media art, and why it never really breaks. For example, in 1.1 from '99, she created a database that used a web crawler to collect all the URLs in the world. And soon she discovered that the web was growing faster than the database. In Foam Imager, Jävebrott used a web crawler to collect different information about websites, such as their length, when they were made, which network they belonged to, and what colors were used. And then this information was selected by a computer, and images functioning as statistical diagrams are created. A few years ago, Jävebrott also produced a piece called Rösten, or The Voice, commissioned actually from the Swedish National Public Arts Council, which might be the first commissioned web piece in the Nordic region. I'm not really sure about that. Here she displays all the keywords typed on the internal search engine on the council's website. The words are displayed in chronological order and are shortcuts to relevant information belonging to the keyword. So one of the founders of CRAC, which I mentioned earlier, is the Swedish artist Peter Hagdahl, who should be mentioned in this context. He's a former professor of media art, the first professor of media art at the Royal Institute in Stockholm, and has for a long time focused on the complexity of actions and interactions in society between people and technology in different virtual spaces. His public project, created for the University of Teachers in Stockholm, Dream Generator, consists of several sensors placed in the university. So they kind of pick up information and translate it into other kinds of 3D animations that move according to the data as it's processed. This is another public installation. I just thought it could be fun to bring it in this context, which is just from now. Hogdal has influenced the Nordic scene intellectually and practically as the initial force behind crack, behind the person, I would say very much behind the New Media Laboratory, Mayan Labs in 2006, and as professor at the university. In the 90s, he made a number of collaborations also with Carl Michael von Haushoff, who is not only one of the most important Nordic names of sound art, in terms of influence and organizational capacity, not least, but also a visual artist of importance. He has a number of installations. They've been on a number of installations working with radar equipment and oscilloscopes to describe reality through these technologies. Okay, I'm going to skip some stuff and go to Iceland. This is a very difficult thing to do. But it's good to start with Steina, who is an important pioneer of new media and video from the region. She's born in 1940 in Reykjavik, and in the 50s she came to Prague to study violin, where she met the Czech engineer and filmmaker Woody Vasulka. In 65 they moved to New York, where Woody started to work in the film industry, and Steina freelanced as a musician. Woody had started to make experiments with electronic images and sound, and brought some of his equipment from work home, and they started to play around with it. For Woody, the video technology offered a way to question narratives, and he was amazed by the possibilities of video feedback. Together, and probably thanks to Steina's background as a musician, they also started to connect audio inputs to the video in order to create different effects. They realized that both the audio and the video signal consisted of waveforms, and that these could be exchanged for each other, in turn generating interesting results that could be processed into a complete piece. I'm going to talk about the image that you just seen now. I think. Maybe later on. Okay, never mind. In 1971, Steina Woody started the Kitchen here in New York, which became a home for experimental music, video, and performance projects and discussions, as you know. From working closely with Woody during the 60s, Steina started to focus on her own work in the 70s. Her All Vision and Machine Vision series are today considered as milestones. She started to separate the video camera from the human view in different installations. She used the mirrored sphere, which she placed on a crossbow, and at the end of the crossbow there would be two cameras, and one on each end, so she would like shoot. As they were filming a spherical mirror, they could project the entire surrounding space, so they could project 360 degrees. She also started to experiment with running the violin through audio synthesizer in order to affect video signals in her project Violin Power. I'm going to cut one and show you another. Let's see. Yeah, maybe I'll just show you a minute of this one. It's really short. This is just her mucking about. It's nice. But I wanted to show you this. So this is a documentation of an exhibition in Reykjavik called Art Against Architecture. Okay. So in the middle, I'm going to talk a bit more about Steinar and Willy. In the middle of the 70s, the Vasoko started to collaborate with programmers, which led to the development of digital tools such as digital image articulator, imager, as you probably know, used in several pieces from the 80s. And in the 90s, she started to work as artistic director of STEAM in Amsterdam, where she, together with Tom de Meyer, developed the first VJ software called ImageIn. Steiner's pioneering work is of great importance for the development and understanding of both video and new media art, I think, and has inspired many. Both her and Sjölander's art was, for example, great sources for the Swedish group Bioff when they, as early as '96, started to experiment with analog and digital video in combination with internet streaming, which later on resulted in the non-TV TV station and the streaming organization Splinter Mind, which included a network of large number of artists, galleries, museums, and organizations all over the world. I just have this image up because I want to briefly mention a site which I commissioned last year with extensive material by the New York duo Melissa Dubin and Aaron Davidson, which is available online with interviews, quite extensive interviews shot in '96, '97, and '98 in New Mexico, where they currently live. So if you want to have a lot of this, that's the place to go. So until recently, perhaps Steinar has had not so many followers in Iceland. What would you say?
She's always been around.
She's always been around. She's always been around. Yeah, she's been going to the school and doing stuff. And, yeah. But maybe we could claim that there are not so many artists working in a sort of more media-based. No, we couldn't claim that either, could we? No, it's been quite a lot. Yeah, there's been quite a lot in the 80s. Yeah, you're right. I think at least I should mention Sigrun Harðardóttir, Paul Fehr, and Ragnar Helgi Olofsson, who organize themselves in an organization called Lorna Lab. Olofsson is famous for his piece Web Waste, where the web visitor is invited to upload his or her computer trash to Olofsson's piece, and then the waste is exposed as a mess of text, image, and sound. He's also worked with interactive video installations a lot. And then I just took this up because which is Paul Fehr's Eternal Sunset, where he has connected online cameras all over the globe. So you can basically it's a perpetual sunset, basically. So it doesn't fit so well with gallery hours, but I think it's a nice piece. Then we should mention Finnbogi Peterson, born 1959, who has received great attention for his sound art installation that all kind of connect to 60s minimalism, maybe we could say. In the Venice Biennale 2001, he created the installation Diabolos, where he used the interval between the two tones that the Vatican Church banned in the mid-ages. The interval is called Diabolos Musica, and no one really knows why. I think it's just some music historians think it's just an unusual combination of tones.
It's a certain
distance
between tones that
yeah,
called Diabolos.
yeah.
He was projecting that sound.
Yeah. But the reason why it's called Diabolos is not really clear. I mean, it's not necessarily an evil tone. It sounds bad.
Since the church thought it was
but the
bad,
church thought it was bad, so it became. Yeah, exactly. So exactly. So one speaker is on 61 hertz and the other is on 44 or something. But it also creates, at the same time, this also created a kind of non-hearable 7 hertz sound wave, which has an effect on the ripples of the water. He also uses this effect on installations such as Dream and Sphere, where very low frequencies just affect the water frequency, the water surface. So you can't hear it, but you can see it. Okay. There are about 100 more artists to talk about, but we're going to do this in a short time. This minimalism can also be found in Danish artist Jeppe Hein, whose installation Invisible Labyrinth created labyrinths where the walls were just infrared lights, so you could feel the walls as vibrations if you wore a headset and you walked around. And then he built like Pac-Man labyrinths, or the maze outside Kubrick's film The Shining and things like that. In 2002, he smashed the white cube of a gallery with a ball of metal with a diameter of 70 centimeters. The visitor crashing into the wall. The ball was moving around in empty space, activated by a sensor and the visitors. So I can show you a clip where it's not smashing anything, where it's just rolling around. So you get the idea. So, Danish artist Mogens Jacobsen, born 1959, has in some studies of time and dynamics in video reached results that reminds us of Steinar Vesåker's work. Lately, that's 5-6 years ago, he's been working with his own software that allows him to regard video as a 3D object in a space more than a chronological sequence of frames. So he's kind of transformed video to another kind of thing. Jacobsen belongs to the first generation of artists that understood the possibilities of computers and making art with a computer exclusively without the need to print or transfer into a stable media in order to get an artistic result. Of course, okay, I skipped something here, sorry. Right. We can talk about this. I mean, it's thanks to the chance to work with computers and powerful enough, but it's also an intellectual shift that took place with these artists, where computers had a value that didn't have to be transformed to traditional techniques. So they could just be compared to Sture Hansson, for instance, or Ann-Charlotte Jansson, or Becken Jung, who used computer design to design images that they then transformed into graphic prints or into paintings or things like that. This is actually a graphic print. So Mogens Jacobsen didn't experience the same attitude problem as Teresa Wennberg, which I described, even if the computers of the late 80s and early 90s definitely had their limits. For 3 years in a row, 93 to 95, he received honorary mentions at Ars Electronica. The first years in the category of computer graphics, and then later on in interactive art with the installation called Entropy Machine, where he says that he finally managed to free the computer from the traditional art techniques. He had by then gone through a process where he looked for the possibility to use the computer in a way that wasn't just a substitute for, quote, the pen, the brush, and spray cans, unquote. Since he had seen its possibilities with interactive communication, advanced information processes, and simulations. With the Entropy Machine, he worked with ideas of cloning, hormone therapy, DNA, and so on. I'm trying to cut myself down. I'm talking too much. So basically he had these petri dishes that were also affected by the people who were in the gallery. So you would be part of creating this new DNA situation, which is quite interesting. Jacobs was also involved in founding the Danish organization Art Node, that has since then been an important node for media activists in Denmark, as a kind of intellectual resource with articles, producer of exhibitions, net art, and so on, which is remarkably early. The same year as Edda's website started, and 1 year before Rhizome, actually. So Artnet is still around and should not be confused with the Swedish organization with the same name. So in Denmark, I thought it could be relevant to bring this up. Two artist groups have developed a very large project that makes activist thinking, business strategies, design, and technology. And Superflex project, sometimes forgotten project, Karlskrona 2 from 1999, showed early on the possibilities of virtual environments. And I'll show you another image, it becomes clearer. It's the same as the screen in public space. So they've built a virtual copy of the Swedish city Karlskrona and its inhabitants. the inhabitants in the real city could create, or the flesh city, could create avatars to inhabit the virtual city. So as avatars, they were able to change and rebuild their own city. The project kind of showed, maybe, how virtual space can be used as a tool in city planning, and sort of to have public opinion on city planning processes, and how it can be used to catch ideas and kind of formalize ideas from the inhabitants. You know, not just sending out a questionnaire, but they can actually actively be. Then you can ask yourself which inhabitants have the tools and the capacity. But I think also there was a part of this project also where people were educated to use the tools, of course. N55 was a Copenhagen-based artist group that I would also want to mention quickly. That started with the aim to rebuild the city from within, working with different activist projects that merge technology, design, and architecture. In 2000, they created Floating Platform and N55 Space Frame, which you see here. That together function as a working space and home for the artists in the group until about a month ago. Unfortunately, I don't know if they've sold it, but they're being gentrified. But they've created alternative architecture inspired by Buckminster Fuller, as you see, and for mobile compact living. And they also created a project called Rocket System, which was made to, it could spread flyers from the altitude of 5,000 meters or something. And Learning Site doesn't exist. I'm sorry, N55 doesn't exist anymore. But two of the artists, Ricky Luther and Cecilia Wendt, now work together under the name Learning Site, and continue to work in the trajectory in between art and architecture. This is a speaker home, which amplifies the living or the building construction. That's a good word. And I think that both of these groups have definitely been influential in a younger generation of artists in the whole region, I would claim, in terms of discourse, but also, you know, in terms of thinking about infrastructure and thinking about city planning, but also, I mean, they've been active as teachers in Aarhus, in Copenhagen, in Umeå, and more. So, one of the first artists to experiment with video in the 60s was painter Rolf Aamodt, who used electronic images, for example, in Evolution from 1967, made for Norwegian public television. I'm going to skip that now. And some of the most significant video art experiments in Norway around 70 was when a group of artists, including Marianne Heske, started to produce independent videos. Marianne Heske's first videotape, Mask, dates back to 1975. It includes a black and white image of a doll's head, which will be a recurring image in her work. A work that comprises media such as video engraving, installation, performance, and sound. In the words of her friend, Namjoon Paik, and I quote, "TV is attacking us all our lives. We can now attack back." End quote. And in relating to TV from 1977, she criticizes the influence of TV on the audience. In the video, a group of people sit watching TV. Their faces are replaced by dolls' faces. Someone has to help me with my pronunciation here. Gilje. Okay, what's a Gilje? Point 69 has been devoted to real-time video processing for many years. Starting with Steiners and Demir's image, Ine, and later on moving on to Max. Working with these tools, it points out that you can work in real time but still have full control over both structure and context, trying to focus on perception and conception of reality using technology. In 1999, started to investigate live aspects of video with music, dance, and theater as references, since these art forms have a history of improvisation in real time. And has since then been working on its own, but also with the VJ group 242 Pilots, and as part of the Norwegian dance company Kreutzer Company. And finally, being a Swede, I can't help myself. I have to mention the Norwegian style. born 65, who, when internet was new and all was possible, became the sugar daddy of cyber sex. The revolution that thankfully didn't happen, with his Cyber SM project in 1993. This project was aimed at creating a system for real-time visual, sonic, and tactile communication over telephone lines. Bringing telephone sex to another level. Stensler created 2 stimulator suits that 2 people could use physically to touch each other over distance. In '93, he used the suits to connect users in Paris and Cologne. So, actually, perhaps I should show a film by Anne Lislegård just to compensate that. Let's see how I do this. Yeah, I'll show this, and then I'll tell you why in part 2 if I ever get there. This is silent. This is called Crystal World, and it was shown in Sao Paulo 2011 at the Biennale, I think, and it's based on Lina Bobardi's home and a novel by John Ballard. I'm gonna do something very naughty. Oops. Sorry. No, it doesn't want to do that. So, that was just compensation. Okay, the Finnish scene. Woke up late, but violently. And wasn't really until the 80s when the first sort of video piece was made by Marika Hakula. This is really dangerous. I mean, people here know this stuff so much better than me. And the Torpe group, Earth Contacts from 1982. But new media was really not really established in Finland until the 90s, but it really caught up intensely. There is, however, one early prominent figure in the Finnish scene who should be especially mentioned, which is Erkki Kornimi. He's not only a pioneer of the Finnish scene, but belongs to some of the first people who developed the tools that he was working with. You might actually have seen his first, I don't know if it was his first, but the kind of first international recognition of his work in Orangery last year at Documenta 13. And in the Documenta catalog, Lars Bangladesh writes, quote, "Refuting the common equation of technology with frigid thought and loss of sensuality, his work revolves around a radical imagination that sets out to redefine life itself." I thought that was nice. Already in the 60s, he composed computer-generated music and designed his own synthesizer, the Andromatic, purchased by Swedish composer Ralph Lundsten. Since then, he has moved between art, science, music, computers, robotics, apparently painting, I found out today. And around 70, he worked with a number of original synthesizers in the DMI, Digital Music Instrument series. In 71, he collaborated with dancers around his DMI-O, or DMI, a type of video synthesizer that he used the monitors of the dancers to generate real-time soundtrack. I'm going to show you a clip from that. Sorry, I'll show you a clip from that now.
Ordinary electronic organ, memory, and some video circuitry. The organ keyboard is a separate unit, and the video interface permits one to see the contents of the memory on the TV screen. So, first, the simplest way of using this instrument is just playing it like an organ. Only difference being that what you play is stored into the memory, and it is displayed as a kind of graphical notation on the monitor screen. Then one can continue and start to transform the stored pattern, for instance, moving it, transposing, reading or playing backwards, adding new things, erasing it, and maybe starting again. And in addition, there is input for video camera, so that any object can be transformed into kind of score, and we are going to make some simple experiments with this facility, letting a dancer create her own music through this camera and this instrument.
Gets very dramatic after that. Okay. So he's been working kind of on towards the end. He's been working on. He claims he's been working on artificial intelligence with the aim to merge man and machine. This is the next thing. So when video became established in the 1980s, a number of video artists entered the scene, among them Eija-Liisa Äättälä, of course, who established herself as a major international video artist. Marita Luilo, I'm sorry if my pronunciation is bad, was the first Nordic artist to work with CD-ROM, and she had great success with her piece Ambitious Bitch from '96, where she investigated femininity. This was followed by Son of a Bitch in 1999, where she worked with masculinity in the end of the millennium. And then she created basically she created a virtual apartment of the psychoanalyst Jack L. Freud in QuickTime VR, where you could basically, you know, be guided through the game by a virtual butler called Esko. So it's like 1.5 decades before Siri entered our iPhones. Yeah, I'm just not going to. I'm going to skip now. As I said, the place to go is Finland when it comes to a certain kind of media art, or has been. Not the least thanks to a number of small, vibrant and vivid organizations and festivals such as the artist group Katastrofe, Katastrof.fi, the media festival Pixelake, artist-run organization MU, M-Cult, Avanto Festival, but also thanks to the Contemporary Art Museum Kiasma, who have had an impact on the entire region and organized a number of important exhibitions. as well as early on buying work to the collection that had media and had a media curator from the start in 98. Yeah, 98. So I think a lot of young artists have developed their practices around the chiasma context. Okay. So when scraping the surface by attempting to summarize a Nordic media art scene from the 1960s in an hour, it becomes obvious that the most important development took place in collaborations between artists. Perhaps with the execution of the dynamic first, with the exception of the dynamic first period of Moderna Museet in the direction of Pontus Hultén, even if this too was extremely oriented around, in tune with, and grown up out of a dialogue with a circle of experimental artists. And perhaps Chiasma in Helsinki after it opened in '98. But I think it's the same situation there. There was a lot of artists surrounding the development of this scene. And I think that artists have gathered together, sharing expensive equipment around common ideas generated by new technology and certain movements in society in general. But what also happened during the internet boom of the mid-1990s were that a few large companies gave artists the opportunity to experiment with new technology. And I think that also played an important role at that time. Examples might be Saab, which no longer exists, and Swedish state television, I would say, the 1960s, and Norwegian state television also was quite fantastic partners, and still are, I would say, the public televisions in the Nordic countries. And even if the latest decades of great exchange with the international scene has, of course, meant that Nordic art scene might have lost this Nordic identity, whatever that means. You've also seen that there never was such a thing. It's always been globally active and influenced. But I think perhaps one or two artists that I just mentioned could be given a bit more attention. Yeah. So the thing is, I have a part 2 here, but have I totally run over my time?
You have 9 minutes.
Maybe it's better that I stop here.
Maybe it's a good time to open up.
Yeah, I think it makes sense. Because part 2 gets kind of, I go bonkers and use the freedom of not being an art historian. So maybe we just stop there. And if there's any questions, yeah.
Can I ask you to go back to your lecture when you talk about commonality and a narrative? What kind of?
That's part 2. Yeah. No, but we can talk about it. Yeah. What do you want to ask?
Well, obviously, you pointed out that there is certain instrumentality in this notion of Nordic, but also you mentioned the notion of narrative, and narrative is not just instrumental; it's an agency.
Yes, exactly.
So
what I
comment on
yeah.
that?
Okay. So what I was I think a reason why this Nordic thing is another reason why it's very infected, which I didn't, because I kind of stopped here in the 90s. It was this whole kind of Nordic Miracle thing, which was, it was a fantastic array of artists who just suddenly popped up and received global attention, like Annika Eriksson, Oliver Eliasson, Annika von Haushoff, so on and so on. Not least within video-based, or DVD-based maybe, production. It was massive, and it was fostered very much by a narrative. This is also when Daniel Birnbaum pops up, and Hans-Ulrich Obrist pops up, and David Elliott is in Sweden, and it was kind of fostered by this myth, this kind of Nordic art is about loneliness and wilderness, and nature, and there's a few sentences that kind of, I'm being very harsh now, so, but there it was definitely part of kind of the art world discourse of promoting the so-called Nordic Miracle, and it's become really infected because there are a lot of artists who don't want to subscribe to that myth. So what I was going to propose was to go further, basically, and cannibalize it and just actually affirm that narrative and just say that society, global society, is suffering from a kind of political depression right now. We're all, you know, if you don't make it in this kind of the current regime, you either look for religion or the fantastical, or all of these words that we're connected to precisely the Nordic Miracle. And even if you know, suicide rates and odd examples don't constitute a culture, this kind of cliche could be used as a means of kind of reinventing the importance of the sea as such, or reinventing the sort of taking this label that's going to end up on whatever you do when it has Nordic funding anyway, and affirming it and turning, you know, internalizing, metabolizing it into something else. So that's basically where I was going with that. But in a lot more delicate terms.
So are you suggesting that after the first phase, which can be also associated with marketing because it's part of the whole system, now we are entering second phase when people have more critical attitude to that?
I think it's a very strong critical. I think there is. I mean, the critical attitude is there. It's just a question of how you use it. And so far, I mean, the last couple of sort of Nordic shows have kind of started by stating, oh, you know, this Nordic thing, which is, you know, in its criticality, you know. So you'll have a big show with Nordic artists in often in a foreign country, and you'll start by stating that this Nordic thing is really, it's just, that's not the primary issue here. It's a show about something else, which is fine. But what I would propose is that you could take that criticality and turn it upon itself in a way, because it's also a way of avoiding the question, and then it's very easy that someone else will dictate for you the conditions of which it is framed, because I'm not sure that you, as an artist, or even as a curator today, have that power necessarily. And one way to retain that power would be to consume it, reappropriate it. So that's basically what I was saying. Which is a bold proposal, of course. Requires some examples. Silence.
Well, I don't want to occupy the discussion, but I mean, there are some obvious questions about that. How you can even address that notion without addressing broader context? Because modern history in, let's say, second half of the 20th century was dominated by East and West axis. South and North, which has been for centuries really very, very important, was kind of absent, although it was there. But now with crisis and all this, what has happened in the last 20 years, you see how this North and South thing is emerging with a vengeance. And the debate about Nordic has really, I think, important implications, because if you don't address this in a broader context, you will be kind of in a vicious circle. So I have a question about this. How much is this issue addressed in Nordic countries?
I think social engagement in general is quite a big thing. I mean, I would say that that's a whole set, you know, all too long lecture again, of examples of artists who are working in social engaged projects. And also I think that a lot of the schools have been exploring, not least kind of art and architecture in in relation to the north-south divide and sort of what role an us could take as agent or as informer or as producer of change, maybe. I think it's definitely a big thing.
Do you have any examples? I mean, superflex are the ones that are more known doing this kind of engagement with public, an agency.
Yeah.
But who are the other artists that you would say that they address these issues? As very well the gentleman said, you cannot talk about contemporary art without contextualizing what especially is happening now.
Yeah.
And I happen to be from the south, I'm from Greece, so I can see now how this, you can avoid not addressing the issues that they're happening today. So how would you describe them? Who are these artists?
There's several artists. I would say many of them are working in several different media. Maybe you could say that there are two trends. There's one that's kind of more activist-oriented. Maybe it's Superflex would fit into that, or learning science, or that kind of practice. And then there's this kind of more journalistic approach, maybe, with artists like Jesper Nordahl. We can go through the list.
Can I just respond to that and perhaps also connect to the previous question? What you're referring to basically is the duality of mentalities between the South and the North, pretty much, and the economical aspect of that, I think, in the broader context that you mentioned. And I think to be able to contextualize that within the art, at this moment you have to really have both mentalities as an artist
at the same time.
At the same time, and and another problem is, in the Nordic countries, is to get funded like that, because it's still very Nordic, and if you want to expose this duality between South and North, it's going to be very difficult to get any funding from that, because it's built still on the myth. And it's the same in Greece. If you want to be part of the Greek art scene, you really have to dwell on the Greek myths as well. Unfortunately, there's no real art center in Europe anymore, which is also a strength. But I think in this sense, it's a weakness.
But don't you think it's a good example is that you brought Katerina Zgraev's project that she did for the biennial? Katerina brings this out in a way, and she used many Greek artists. I mean, Paidakis, the facade, was very much influenced from the Byzantine and all these myths. But do you think it was a successful duality between the what she did between South and North in this pavilion? I mean, I don't want
it's
to
not my
be
place to pass
critical,
judgment over
but
that.
it is,
But I think
it is about an effort of breaking. That was Katerina's utopian idea.
Sure, absolutely.
So I don't know. Again, if
I think the way she produced it was very intelligent. She had with this kind of scene for talks and performances and this ongoing discourse.
I mean, it had a sustainability, but at the same time, it had a lot of. It's difficult. It's very difficult to play because it's such a. It's not just the monetary difference between South and. It's mentality, it's attitude, it's culture, is.
Sure.
I just wanted to say that when the Nordic breakout happened in the 90s, it was all about globalization. But now everybody's talking about global and local. So I think that we had to reconsider this 90s phenomenon.
No, it was.
I think that we cannot erase the history of thousands of years, like 10,000 years. People have been living in the Oslo area. Of course, there is north and south, but there is also something.
But I think that
binds us close all together. We all come from a small group of people that went to Asia 70,000 years ago, and we spread to Europe and everywhere around the world. So we're all connected. But a lot happened in between. So there is north and south and east and west.
But what I would say about this just the rhetoric around. I was kind of surprised myself actually when I started reading the texts to find that there was so many traces of this language and portrayal of these, tropes in all the texts describing the specific artists. But yes, I mean, it was intended as something that, okay, Nordic goes global, but in order to do that, it kind of had to create, what is it that's going global or whatever, I don't know. But I was quite surprised myself when I started reading through it. It was actually...
Which text?
Daniel Birnbaum's texts and David Elliott's and Maria Linde's even, certain points. I can show you that. I was just surprised to see that it was, and I don't think it was reflected. I think it was just something that's kind of happened at the time.
Any very pressing questions? I think it's time to wrap up. We give Jonatan an applause.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you very much, Jonatan.
Yeah, thank you.
And, I just want to give a brief, provide a brief perspective of what's going on further with this whole Nordic Outbreak context of this lecture also. So tonight we are having an exhibition in the Manhattan Bridge Art Fair in Dumbo. I think a group of us will be touring there directly hereafter. On Saturday there's a symposium which is lecture for the Historic Foundation for. And then of course in the fall, should you be in the Nordic countries or want an excuse to go there, Nordic Outbreak will tour across the Nordics and it will, among others, be visiting the Hiasma in Reykjavik, that's in Helsinki, Reykjavik Art Museum, Spring City Festival in Stavanger, the Catwalk in Nuuk, that's a cultural center in Greenland, and also the Danish Architecture Center. And it will take many different shapes as moving image exhibitions in public space with interesting screenings. So that will be, and of course, on Friday, we are having a very interesting exhibition as well at Dag Hammarskjöld Plaza. We're going to show some, well, all the artists are very significant, but I'm looking very much forward to this one. Some of them haven't exhibited in this way in public space before. So you will have a nice introduction by the World Council of People for the United Nations, and that should be very, very interesting as well. So thank you all for coming, and I hope that we'll see you in Dumbo, starting at 6 till 9 tonight.